Well, thank you for coming out on a typical Brisbane day or whatever. I thought the way I would do this is to talk a bit about my work and assume that some people here haven't seen it or know little about it or don't know anything about how I go about it and what I do. And then I thought I would open it up for you to ask questions and ask specifically about works or about how I go about things. So first of all, I used to do a lot of teaching and a lot of other things, and about 10 to 15 years ago I gave up all that other stuff. I ran art schools, I was the director of the National Art School in Sydney, and I was head of La Trobe Arts University art department and all those sorts of things, which helped me get in the regular wage. But I always painted, I always made art during that period. I must have had about probably, without exaggeration, 70 or 80 solo exhibitions all over this country, New Zealand, Berlin, Paris, London. I've got a show coming up for the Bath Festival in England. So lots of different things that I involved myself in. And I always, as an artist, like the idea of putting the work out there and getting feedback, making a few sales sometimes. You know, we all have to live, because for the last decade or more, I've lived entirely, 7 days a week, I go to the studio. So I do what all artists have to do nowadays. My morning ritual is to wake up and do the admin. I have an assistant that comes in a day or two a week. My partner, for those that don't know, is Wendy Sharp, who is even far more famous than me, and she has an exhibition which I think is closing today, or Philip Bacon. She's been on the last month there. So she exhibits as well. So we both talk about art and usually talk about who's won this prize or who hasn't won a prize or whatever, and we have a chat about that, and then we go off to our separate studios. The studio that I work in, which is in Sydney, some of the time, is almost as large as this gallery. It's a huge space. I'm very, very lucky to have this great big warehouse where I just sit there and contemplate my navel and look at art and try to develop and push the ideas forward. So I'm often planning for an exhibition a year or 2 years ahead of schedule. So, for example, with Mike Mitchell here, I think it was a couple of years ago that we planned this exhibition, and I've been working on things and saying, yes, no, that's going to go to Mike, and this. So I'm slowly building up, because you have to be, as a professional artist, you have to think ahead of schedule and make sure that you're, one step ahead. The one thing, when in the early days when I wasn't well planned, I would be painting them right up to the last minute and then sending them off to exhibitions somewhere or other. And usually in those days there was much more art criticism, and people at the end of the day would say of the artwork, the art critic would say, the last three in the show in the final room look very rushed and and they'd always pick out the weaknesses. So I'm lucky now that I have a big studio space, so I can put all the work up and I can sit and I can look at it, warts and all, and I can see things that are wrong before I finally decide to frame it, send it off to the gallery, and then put it on the walls, and then get feedback from people like yourselves as to the work and what's happening. So that in a nutshell is what I do, and I think and organise myself in my studio in Sydney. I do a lot of travelling, and one of the things that Wendy Sharp and I decided some years ago is that we kept going back to Paris and we kept renting places. And the story which she tells, which I now add to, is that we're walking along one day, and she said, in Paris, and she said, I had a word with a tax man, and there's no point in ever buying anything here in Paris, even if we could afford it, because it's much better to rent, and then you can claim it back on the tax, and so we need to be sensible. And we walked on a little bit further, we got to a street corner, and I said, You don't always need to be sensible. And she said, yes, that's right. And we decided to, we only just did it, get a mortgage and get a very, very a small, it's 40 squares, rooftop little place. It was beyond the 6th floor in Paris, and it has the smallest lift, which those that know Paris know what very small lifts are like. We always say it's a lift for 2 people or 3 very close friends. And you go up on the lift and you come out and you have views over Paris rooftops, and it's just magic. And so we go there, or sometimes I go there and Wendy comes later, and vice versa. But we go there and we operate from there, also making art, and quite a bit of this art was produced there. The other part of that art was produced from looking at Brisbane, obviously, looking at images of Brisbane, visiting places, getting people like Mike Mitchell to drive me around and say, have you looked at down here by the river, or have it, and just analysing and observing things and finding things, because I enjoy working with subject matter which is about Brisbane as well. So this exhibition, as you can see, really deals with the 2 big, very different but very intoxicating cities, both Brisbane and Paris. What do I do and how do I go about it? Well, I work with a thing called oil pastel. People know what that is. It's a sort of solidified stick. I use a brand, and I don't have shares in the company, called Crépin or Caran d'Ache. And Caran d'Ache oil pastels are very opaque, and I've just got used to them over the years. And really what you do with them is they're a bit messy, they're a bit mucky, but they have a range of about, I think it's 96 colours or whatever, so it pretty much covers the colour spectrum. And so I can sit there with a board, say in Paris, leaning against a wall, looking over at one of the bridges in Paris, and I can sit there and I can make quick notations. I can draw it, I can colour parts of it in, I can look around me and see what I want to do. I can do the same when I'm looking in Brisbane in the park, and I can look at shapes and I can make quick notations with oil pastels. It's a very direct, quick medium to use, and I find I can just, sometimes I write shopping lists on the work itself, on the drawings, like needs to be dark here, or bring more tonal contrast in the foreground, or intensify this. So I got little notes for myself as I go along. I take photographs, and usually therefore plastered on the, imagine this is the studio wall, there's lots and lots of photographs all hung around, there's drawings, there's little notes and shopping lists which I've just told you about, and then there's a canvas or a large sheet of paper in the middle of it, and I say, well, I'll take a bit of that and I'll take a bit of this, and I make an amalgam of the information that I've got to work on, to actually think about what I want to do. So looking at directly behind you, and so let me Rick, you're next to do this, but because we'll talk about them afterwards. Starting at the back there are all pictures which are to do with stairwells and to do with, well, one of them's the metro, but you've got to climb stairs up and down. And I thought, and I started working on this as a series, I thought to myself, stairwells are interesting, intriguing places, because they, when you see a stairwell, it almost takes me back to my childhood. I want to know what goes beyond, or I want to climb the stairs, descend or ascend the stairs. I want to look at where they're going to take me. So it's a sort of theatrical device, if you like, to take you into a space, an intimate space where you have to open a door and you have to step inside. So those sorts of things are things that just intrigue me, and they become sort of the metaphorical in some ways. Stairwells are things which take you from one point to another, and I've always liked the idea of psychology or theatre or physical space in which you, the viewer, are the next person to step in. You might be able to hear your footsteps walking into them, and then suddenly you're in this particular space, as I say. And I like that idea of setting up clues for you to step into. And that's true whether or not I'm dealing with somewhere like stepping stones here, from which it really is, from being in the Paris apartment and going up the steps and around, and at the top is Sacré-Cœur, and it's Rue de Mont-Cenis is a road that we can climb up, and you can get to Sacré-Cœur at the top. So where the studio is, for those that a lot of people say, oh yes, I know Paris, and you say, well, Montmartre, oh yeah, I know Montmartre. Well, it's the other side of the hill in Montmartre. It's not the Pigalle, it's not the, in some ways, the seedy side of, you know, the late night strip joints and whatever else. It's on the other side, and it's a quiet, very residential area, which is very Parisian, where you actually have to practice speaking French and blundering your way through. So that's an interesting place to work in and to and just to use as a base, because Paris is such a condensed city. I mean, and as you know, looking out of windows, and many of Wendy's works more recently and have been involved in being a voyeur, just looking through windows, because you can't help it, because people are always opening and closing curtains. Usually in Paris, people are going outside and smoking on the balcony or the veranda and going back in again because they're all smokers over there. I mean, you see the world, and you see the world through somebody else's eyes and through the apartment. You can see what time they come home. You can tell what time they go to bed. You know, you've got all sorts of things that you may not, just simply because you're vis-a-vis, you're facing another building opposite you, and you can see lights come on or whatever. So it's that Alfred Hitchcock Rear Window, you know, movie, if those that can go back to that time. They're interesting, sort of intriguing places to look at. So I go and I look in doorways and draw pictures of that. I'm also interested, as I say, in little places, little vignettes, little places that I've visited. You know, around the corner there is views out of the back window from where I'm looking. Another one here, which is involved in an interior with a Parisian, or with the River Seine, and some of the buildings and lights and people having, you know, as a cups of tea or whatever else. Another one which is involved in looking at a balcony and just people looking down or looking back at you. Another one, interior, exterior, from the inside, in this case having a glass of wine, looking outside again. They're invented spaces, and this one here, which is about a bridge, a night study, just looking at a bridge in Paris, down by the islands, right in the Ile de la Cité, looking at some of the boats coming up and looking at the sky changing. So I do lots of kind of memory things that are involved in that sort of subject matter. And I never tire when I go to Paris. I keep thinking, so I'm going there again in June, and I think, and when I first arrive, I think, so what am I going to do this time around? Well, I know now I'll start off with stairwells, but even if I didn't have anything in mind that I wanted to do, I know that I wouldn't be short of ideas, because everywhere you look there's interesting things that happen. You can deal with doorways, and you can deal with, you know, the architecture is very human, and obviously it's very unified, it's very consistent. It was only on my, and I went there early on, I won a scholarship to go there from London all those years ago and had a very exciting time. And it was then that somebody said to me, I thought, this is so much more beautiful than London. London's got nice bits in it, because I'd come from London to Paris. And I thought to myself, but Paris is just so magical and beautiful. And somebody said, and it's a really important little lesson to learn, it wasn't bombed in the war, Bernard. Oh, yes. And of course, that really does, I mean, we don't think about that, or I didn't. And you realise that London looks good in some bits, and there's some pretty, you know, ordinary bits in between it. And of course, that's where the Blitz and all those things happen. Whereas Paris, for whatever reasons, and we can all, you know, look at it, you know, it was saved, and Hitler decided not to wade in there, and so the city, in spite of all the other problems that might exist there, remained as a beautiful, preserved. It's almost like a museum. So often one of the most exciting things that I still do in Paris now is to get the metro somewhere and just say, get off here. And we just, Wendy will walk one way, I'll walk the other. And we just go to a new suburb and we'll just wander around and we'll meet in some little, bistro, in 2 hours. And you just wander through and look at things. And it's just amazing how much, intense culture and little plaques are written up saying, I don't know, Wong Gris painted here, or somebody, all sorts of, and there's more plaques and more little signs up for artists and for people that did things. Berlioz composed Symphonie Fantastique here, and you think to yourself, how wonderful that the arts are celebrated. So I feel, a very strong kindred affinity with a place that puts art right up there, as opposed to just roads named after politicians, So I think there's a sort of balance of that, and and that makes it exciting too. So my work is about looking at particular spaces, little vignettes, little scenes. Sometimes people have bought my work and they've said, and I went with it, and I had a picture of it, and I went and I looked. It's not like that. You moved that building over there, and so they're all done with if you like, an artistic license. So sometimes I remember once someone was having literally an argument with me, saying that bridge you've got in that painting, it wouldn't stand up. And I said, well, and he said, I'm an engineer, I know. And I said, I'm an artist. There's about, it's different things that we're looking for. So, I stand by, he's right, the bridge wouldn't stand up, but I'm interested also in you journeying through space. So rather than it just being one fixed point perspective, where you just stand there, I'm interested in moving through and around the spaces. So sometimes I have drawn bridges from one side, and then I've moved halfway across the bridge and drawn it from there, and I've looked down and I've looked up and I've looked to the side. I've tried to, if you like, bring a number of different angles into the work, which are both those Brisbane pieces have got that in mind as well. You can't quite see all those things from any given point unless you're hovering 10 meters above the ground, and it's sort of, I've invented it. I've invented the space to to maximize what you can see and how you can involve yourself in those spaces. So they're oil paints. The ones that are on this material here, which is a Belgian linen, are done in oil. Sometimes there's oil pastel combined with that as well, but it's oil paint that I use. And I like using oil paint because it stays wet for a period of time, so I can do something on the Monday, and on the Tuesday I can think, oh, that didn't work, and so I can rework it or blend it in or change things around. So I like having a wet or tacky surface that I can come back in, because when I start out, often it's a journey for me. I start up with a blank screen. It might be a canvas like behind us here, it might be a sheet of paper, but I don't know, and I enjoy going on that journey, which is an intuitive journey. I might even pencil in where I think things are going to go, and sometimes it goes on a journey, sometimes I often throw too much into the work, and then I have to pull things out because I realize that everything is getting a bit cluttered and too complex. It's just like anything in life. Sometimes I want to make more impact by putting more things in, and as you know, there's an old adage which says less is more, and sometimes having spaces between things really makes, and then concentrate on what a painting needs, and that's often about pulling things out. So I've learnt that compositionally over a period of time, so I have fun with the journeys and I don't know the end product. The end product can be anything between being thrown away as a disaster because it didn't work out at all, to changing it so much from the beginning that you wouldn't recognize it, to sometimes starting a work in the morning and by the end of the day I think, that's it, I've done it. I think, wow, wasn't that easy? I'll do that tomorrow. doesn't happen tomorrow. And so it's every day is a kind of interesting experience where I enter into my strange imaginary world of color and of tone and of shifting composition and of the art critic John MacDonald, Sydney-based, said Bernard's work is vertiginous. So I had to look it up, and I thought, yeah, he's right. It's sort of angles which you're slightly uneasy with, and you bend and you move your way through, and you kind of find spaces that sometimes a little bit, you feel like a sense of vertigo or whatever as you move through the space. So I like that idea that you can, see things in at different times, and it's not accurate. Sometimes I look around the corner and think, oh, I want to draw that in there as well. So if I was doing a painting of you at the moment, I'd be interested in what's happening up there on the ceiling. I'd also be interested in the speckled surface of the floor. And I'd be interested, I must put that door in there. Oh, I must get that plant in and bring that a little bit over. So I rearrange in my own mind from looking at bits to try to make the composition work. I might bring you forward because I need something large against something small. So I play around with spaces, which is why it's based on something else, not on a photographic, accurate record. It is a long way removed from that, as the engineer said. So, that's an interesting aspect which I like going through as well. So I'm sure that the engineers would say the Story Bridge wouldn't stand up in exactly the same way as Pont Neuf wouldn't stand up if we were, painting that on the Seine. Things, I play around with spaces in order to reinvent and make things work. So I'm working with, as I say, oil pastel. I'm working with oil paint. I'm drawing things, and I'm going on a journey. And when things start to become a bit predictable, when I know the answers to things, I lose interest, or I lose. It's no longer. It no longer grabs me. It is not knowing and coming up with something which may be a discovery. Because every time I do something, I'm hoping it, really, takes me somewhere where I really haven't been before. Or I think this time I'm going to hold the colour right back. It's going to be very tonal. And halfway through I think, nah, it's a bad idea. Make it more colourful, or turn the light up. Or hang on, let's take this to darkness so that we've got more shadow. So I'm always playing around with what could happen. Try this way, try that way. Work it out as you go along. And that's the excitement of art making, that you every time you start something else, you look in front of you. Sometimes I think to myself, I just can't paint. This is just ridiculous. I go on for days and days thinking, what am I doing? Am I painting with my left foot or something? I just can't get anything to work. And that's part and parcel of the challenge. Because if I know the answers, if it's like painting by numbers, how boring is that? Because it means that I know the end product. So it's not a process in which I ever, am in control of. I like to be in control of parts of it, and I have learnt through lots of things through experience. But somebody said, how do you know it's finished? And I always say, well, the real answer is a painting, an artwork is never finished. It's sort of abandoned. It's sort of, you put it up on the wall and you look at it, and this is the true thing, because I've got a studio big enough to do that. I can put this painting up and I can come in and I can make some marks, and I sharpen a line there and bring in the light, and then I did this about 10 times before I got it right, because I wanted something really racing through which showed a sort of shimmering, moving thing, and then I wanted the moon to be absolutely solid so it would make all these things jump and make the light around it do that. So, because this is a camping scene, but I didn't know that, as I say, in advance. It's all trial by area to get to that point. And I think that aspect of having it up there in the studio, to finish off this analogy, it's up there in the studio, and I come in every day and I look at it. And I look at it and I sit there and I have a cup of tea in front of it, and I have my lunch in front of it, or I look at my, you know, computer, and then I'll look at it. And after a while, and I keep doing that for days, weeks. And then finally, at the end of weeks, I think to myself, there's nothing else I can do to this. There's no longer, you know, it's now moving further and further away from me. It's no longer, it's finished, or it's arrived at its statement. And it's either good enough to be put into an exhibition or be abandoned or whatever, but it's gone as far as it can go, which is true of all of these works here. They all work in that level. And sometimes it happens very, very quickly, and I think, I found the magic formula. I just keep doing this, and of course, second time, third time around, it doesn't work. But it's a nice way of being able to, you know, find out how things are working. And it's part of that creative process, which of course, goes up and down, but keeps me really keeps me young, actually. Keeps me kind of, you know, thinking, and they say to me, so which is your favorite painting? And I always say to people, the next one. Because I'm hoping always, you know, I mean, we're all aiming for things, but I mean, wouldn't it be awful if someone said, oh, your painting, yes, I really like your painting back in the 1970s. They were really good then. Oh, thank you. I mean, we all want to, you know, we're all looking for things. The next thing we do will take us to that next stage. And that's what I set out to do every time I go into the studio, is to try to come up with answers. Now, at that point now, because it's sort of 2:30 or whatever else, I thought what I might do is to throw it over to you. I know it's a bit of an intimidating thing, but I just wondered if you have any thoughts or questions, or because I probably left out a whole load of things. I don't know, Mike, whether you think I've missed out anything that I need to explain more fully, or... No, So, yes, please.
Does your colour palette change in between, say, Paris and Australia?
Good question. Well, it does a little bit. There's a little bit of a colour change palette, for example, with that piece behind you there, to some of those on the wall there. Or even, this is Australia as well. This is an amalgam, by the way, of this is going camping, because I used to go camping, but it's a number of different campsites and a number of different memories of camping, and you know, broken down old cars, and you know, and digging things and putting string up. So it's sort of stays in my mind as a sort of, you know, 3 a.m. experience, looking at a particular, so it's not specific, and sometimes they are imagined spaces, and sometimes they are very, very, as I say, specific. But in answer to your question, I think that some of my colour in Paris has been really quite intense. Somebody said to me once, Paris doesn't look like that. And this is a Parisian telling me this. It is much more grey. I said, well, it might not look like that, but it feels like that. And I thought that was a good answer. I must remember that. I remembered it for you, yeah. So I think there are colour changes. And when I come to Brisbane, not so much today of all days, but normally there is an incredible intense light, and obviously tropical colour plants and things which don't exist in more temperate areas. So when I come, I always feel a lovely buzz of warmth. I love the old buildings, the Queenslander, you know, housing, and the cottages, and the way people build things with verandas. I love that intensity of colour. And I think I'm always, when I come and just see that the skyline changes every time I come to Brisbane, I see new things, and I wander off down side streets, or I go, you know, on a ferry up the river. I mean, there's all sorts of things that I do when I come here, and I always think, wow, that's interesting, or that wasn't there before. Paris, of course, is much more stable. You know, if there is anything new in Paris, it's quite a rarity, or every Parisian knows about it. So if they've built a new gallery somewhere, everybody knows. But there's not many places. The buildings they were built in 1863 or whatever, and they're not going to change much. So architects there always say to me, I never get a chance to build new buildings, I just get to renovate interiors. That's the only jobs I ever get, because I can't actually, you know, start from scratch, because you can't touch the facade. What exists. Well, Brisbane is one of those places that's constantly changing, and you know that. You walk up the street, and particularly if you're an outsider, you see it afresh. So I like the idea of coming into new places because you see them differently for the first time.
Yeah, I'll just ask one question.
Sure.
Wendy, does she paint in a similar fashion to you? I haven't seen her work. So
Yeah, no. I mean, other people might have views here. We're different enough. I think we've got there's a common bond. We're both figurative, semi-figurative artists. She deals more with people. But I often say that might not be about people, but these buildings are all alive, and it's about humanity, or they're about people in my buildings. So she takes on slightly different subject matter. But what's lovely is sometimes, I remember we got this place where we had to climb, I think it was over 100 steps in Florence to go to a rooftop, which when you got to the rooftop was just phenomenal. But 100 steps carrying the luggage or whatever else wasn't the best. We got to the top and I said, wow, I can paint up here. And Wendy said the same. So we started painting. And then we brought the work down after the day or whatever, and we pinned it up around. What Wendy painted was so different from what I painted. I mean, it's just interesting. And I think that's an interesting idea, where artists go to the same place and they all have a very different interpretation. I'm sure if you've been part of any art group where you've gone landscape painting or something, it's just amazing the diversity in the ways that... So we help each other. I mean, Wendy is fantastic with tone. She's fantastic with drawing skills and ability. She always says to me, Bernard, help me with composition, because she thinks I can handle that. And so we kind of, you know, there are times when we can help each other, because all artists have things that we do well and some things that we have to work hard to get up to the same level, because as you know, there's 20 things that make up an artwork. Well, if you can do 15 of them very well, you're a clever artist. But you know, the other 5 you're going to have to work particularly hard to work out to get right. So yes, we're different artists, but you would see a common thread in some of our work. Anybody else? Yeah.
I'm very fascinated with your presentation of space, and I'm wondering, coming from the UK, I know you've been here a long time, but very much more confined space. Was that something you felt when you first got here, this sort of openness and being able to see through spaces?
Yes, I wasn't a landscape painter in the UK, and I'm not a landscape painter as such here. Having said that, what happened was that I had all my work from the UK, and someone rolled it all up like a carpet and sent it off to Australia, and then I pinned it back up on walls, etc. So after I'd been here for about a year, so I'd painted here for a year, and then I had work up on that arrived from the UK, and it was a fascinating thing to have work from the UK, work now from Australia, and to look at both. And the work from the UK looked claustrophobic and sort of contained in space, and it was sort of, you know, it was like a mesh of things around, and it was a bit darker as well. And the things that you might imagine if you were talking about when a painter arrives in a new place, what they might do, the light, the spaces, the agoraphobic space in some ways, or gaps between things, all those things were starting to come through. So whether I was just dealing with people talking to each other, instead of putting them right next to each other like this, they were a bit further apart. I just started to do things, and I also painted on a larger scale, which is interesting as well. So there were things that, and I hadn't even considered it, it was only when I saw the work from before, and I was younger and more impressionable in some ways. And so to see the work from the old work and the new work, I thought, wow, this is happening. I never thought that would happen. And I suddenly realized what was occurring, even though I wasn't painting pictures, as I say, of the landscape itself. So yes, there were differences, and once you go forward, it's very difficult to go back as well. So there's some interesting things happened. Mm.
You still have any of those works?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do. I mean, I've sold a few of them, but I've also, sometimes if I've had a big survey show of my work over a long period of time, which I've done before in the Manly Art Gallery and places like that, I've had earlier works alongside later works, yeah. I'll show you them sometime. I mean, it's just interesting to look at, but they are more cluttered. And I think that's something about England, is more cluttered. But you don't think when you sit down, well, I'm English, therefore I've got to do a cluttered painting. I mean, it just happens. So you're not actually thinking what you're doing in the same way as you say, right, I'm in a vast terrain land now, which goes on infinitesimally, and huge skies and huge, and so I'm going to paint that. You don't think like that. It's just that it's somewhere, it goes through your mind. And it's probably the same when I first came to Australia, was the same analogy as, and I'm not putting myself on the same pedestal as this man, but like Van Gogh going from, if you like, Northern Europe and arriving in the south of France, and light, intensity, you know, and suddenly his palette, you know, let's get cadmium orange and, you know, cadmium red and lemon yellow, and let's paint with all the colors that are around. So there is something, I think, that happens with artists, which is why I like traveling and like moving around to different places, because as soon as you arrive in a new place, you see it afresh. And I think that that's an exciting thing. If you walk on the same walk every day, from the studio to the house, in my case, you're probably looking at your machine, or you're looking at something else. You're not actually, or you're chatting with someone, or you're on the mobile or whatever else, but you're not actually looking. When you arrive in a place that you're not used to, you go, wow, look at that, how amazing, what's happening there? And all that is visually, you know, exciting. And it's an analogy that I make with writers who say, yes, when I walked out, or when I arrived in India for the first time, I started writing about how this person, and then this happened, and then that. And so you start to see things, and it's an interesting experience to go through, because you're not used to it, and therefore your heightened sense of, you know, imagination is there. And that's why I like to arrive somewhere where I haven't been and just walk around the corner, because I don't know what's around the corner, and that's exciting. And visually, there are always ways to come up with new ideas and make things work from there. Yes?
In your early days, you were in Darwin, or you arrived in Darwin. How did that affect you as an artist and, you know, as an overall person?
It was... I'll do a short version of this, but because I tell people that I was living in Chelsea in London, and those that know Darwin, I moved to Casuarina in Darwin. So from Chelsea to Casuarina. And that's about, they begin with C, and then they, after that, there's not much in common. It was an amazing experience, and it absolutely blew my mind. It was a little bit, there was a film at the time called Waking Fright. It was I was a little bit thinking, where am I? Whoa! So it was, but you talk about heightened sensibility. It was only just after the cyclone and things like that. So it was a dramatically different, you know, pioneering type town. And I think especially being an artist there as well, it was all a bit weird and a bit strange. There are people here that I taught back in Darwin who've come along today, which is lovely. So there's lots of links and things from the past, you know, it was an exciting place. However, I was pleased to move on from there, I have to say that. So I gained what I could from it, but I think if I'd stayed much longer, I may have, you know, I needed to go to other places. And to tell you the absolute truth, I had an exhibition when I first arrived in Darwin in what was Macquarie Galleries in Sydney. I sent a whole load of work off to them, and they said, we'd love to give you a solo show, which I thought, wow. So, because it was an impressive gallery. So I showed there, and I realised then that I could paint pictures about being in Darwin and some of my experiences and show them in Melbourne, Sydney and others, and I was like a novelty, you know. It was interesting for them to see the kind of things so I felt I could continue as an artist, but I wouldn't. My artistic career itself in Darwin, or showing in Darwin, well, I don't think there would be anybody that would, or very few people that would want to buy or have the money to buy artworks. So surviving as an artist, you know, you need a market and an audience, and in fledgling city of Darwin at that stage, that there wasn't much around here. But it was great experience, and the fact when I was teaching there, I was often travelling as well. So I was going to Sydney and I was going to Melbourne, and I was sometimes flying back to Europe at Christmas or something like that. So those sorts of experiences all balanced together was making it possible for me to keep going in Darwin. But it is a difficult place to spend a long period in those days. It may be different now. Yeah.
I was just interested in the way you were talking about Paris and the way you walk around and you can see clouds around. And it just took me back to the time when I could just wander around the streets of Paris all day. Yeah. And you just go around the corner and you'd see something wonderful, you know. Yeah. And it also occurred to me, as well as the Blitz, that I don't know, I just have the feeling that Europeans tend to value their heritage a little bit more. Maybe I'm wrong, but Paris, or France rather, they went to the trouble of building the commercial heart of Paris at La Défense outside, and they left the central heart of Paris the way it was. And then I compare that with what's happened in Brisbane, say. And I mean, not only have we had Cloudland and you know, very many beautiful old buildings like the public trustee, you know, all these buildings along Eagle Street that were once there that are all gone. But it even still happens today, you know. I just kind of, you know, with these old Queenslanders, every day there are Queenslanders that are going, that just get moved out and replaced with units, and it breaks my heart a little bit. I just wonder if you've got any.
Look, I politically you're spot on, and I think that, I mean, the first time I came, in Darwin in 1976, I think it was early 77, I came to Brisbane. I visited Brisbane, and as you probably know, I'm sure you know more than me, the Bjelke-Petersen and era and things disappearing in the night and all sorts of. So I'm aware of what, or I'm aware of some of what was lost, and I'm in a city in Sydney which, believe me, you know, the dollar drives everything, and so, you know, the idea of the National Trust saving something, they don't have, they're toothless tigers, and unfortunately. And I don't know why that should be so bad, but it is bad. I often think that if there's a building, say, built in the 1850s in Sydney, I'm just using this as an example, this could be Brisbane, there's nothing built before. That's it. That's the original. So you might as well, if you're dealing with France, you'd say it's Roman or something. You may, I mean, it happens to be built in the 1850s out of brick because that's what they had here. If you knock that down, it's not as though you can dig down below and find some other great, site of something else. Usually that is it. And we tend here to out with the old or in with the new. There is a tendency not to respect what we had and our history and heritage, and a lot of things which I know more about now being in Sydney, of things which are often to do with building unions or whatever else, saying no, you can't touch that. I mean, things got saved by absolute, I mean, the Queen Victoria building in Sydney was saved by, I think, 5 votes to 4, I mean, it's all very, very close. We could have lost a lot more, and all cities in Australia have not really, sensed that the idea of having history and progress next to each other can be very exciting. But that's, you know, I mean, that's obviously a big question. We could have a, you know, a whole debate about this and why that happens. I think there should be a minister for aesthetics, but I mean, you know. Yeah.
So I'm really crap on art, and so not very often I get to talk to the person who made the painting.
Yeah.
When, like, in that painting there's a lot of things. I just realised when you said there's a piece of string and there's a shovel.
Yeah.
How many things are in there that you put in there? Because I've only seen, you know, half a dozen.
Right.
And so I find that quite interesting because it takes me back to camping, and I can see, you know, the shadow on the ground. I just worked it out now. The shadow on the ground of a tree that has gaps in it.
Yeah.
And that's Moonlight Night is quite a classic sort of look. And so you had to have gone camping to understand all the things that are there. And I think I can see most of the things you're trying to point out there. Even like there's a zipper on your tent.
Yep.
And so on. So would you be able to point out everything in that which you wanted to tell us about?
Well,
Or is that
no, but the answer is it's a visual thing that I had more objects and things in there. I think I had a figure in here at one stage. I think I had a lot more happening in the foreground over here on the right. And after a while, it's that thing about taking things out. Some things need to be things need to remain in a painting because they help the painting to work. And some things need to go, not because they're not physically important in the painting, but they're just cluttering it up or they're getting in the way. So there's two things that you do as a painter. You put in the main bits that you want to, and then you've got to try to think through. So I wanted to keep the shovel, I wanted to keep that, I wanted to keep that bit of rag there, I wanted to keep the car, you know, I've done those sorts of things, but then I just wanted something more to do with the feeling or motion or movement, and then when I made that very, very loose, I had to make that tight. At one stage, the moon was flashing around, and this was tighter. I thought, no, I'm going to have the ground crumbling and moving, and I'm going to have that dominating and sitting there. And, you know, and I wanted to have these lines are to do with making the eye move through space. So there are things there like devices. We go up there, we join that shape, we come back around here. It's keeping the eye moving and around through the space. So there's things that are happening which are to do with the formal thing of making paintings, and then there are objects and things that you put in that work or don't work. And it's a balance between the two. So sometimes I put a lot of things in, and then I think, oh, it's just too crowded and it's cluttered. And I think it was Matisse, but a number of different artists have said if it's not relevant in the painting, remove it. It will if it's not having a positive effect in the painting, then it's detrimental and shouldn't be there. So there's a lot of things in this that were, in the end, I think the tent was much bigger. That tree wasn't there at one stage. There's all sorts of things that I've gone through, and that's all about painting, and it's all about thinking, well, it doesn't matter in the end. You know, this was quite a flat horizon, and I wanted to go up, you know, I wanted to, so there's lots of things in there that changed en route, and they happen more through feeling that I needed loose brush strokes, sharp brush strokes, you know, straight lines, all sorts of things that came in as me painting and thinking about what this painting needs.
Now, on contrast, I've done camping a lot, but I've never been there.
Yeah.
Is there as much in that as there is in that?
Yes. Yes. I mean, yeah. Well, there's the same thinking, the same mentality towards a little bit of yellow on the sides of the trees, which are in winter, and therefore the yellow sky beyond. When you stand there, you can't see Sacré-Cœur. But I know that if I go up round the corner, I can do. So it's my artistic, if you like, shift to bring that in there so that we know that we go up those steps and that's what we see there. That cafe bar isn't there, it's further up. Doesn't matter. Needs to be in there because it darkens that at that point. I wanted those street lights to be at angles, almost as if they're kind of, you know, two humans that can converse with each other. I wanted to make more of the shadows. Those shadows are there for maybe half an hour at one point when the light was there, and I was there all day long. But I thought that's the important bit. I want to get the lightness of the shadows as if there's light coming down, and therefore the bits of the trees are lit up with that. And then I'll put a figure here to counterbalance. So there's same thinking going on in all of them, and it's the feeling of that place. If you went there, you say, yeah, I can see where I am. Yes, I can see those steps. But it's not exactly like it. Like that isn't exactly like it. And all of these have all been shifted and changed to make a more intense painting and to make something that you can have a dialogue with. Because if a painting reveals all its secrets to you in 10 seconds or 30 seconds, to me, it's boring. And some art nowadays I look at and think, wow, that's clever and slick, and that's it, you know, and you walk on. Good paintings call you back. You know, when I go into another gallery and I see something which is interesting, I walk past it and think, hang on a minute, I need to go back and spend some time with it, and it draws you back in. It's like good music, good literature, good anything. Yep.
I'd say when you're painting, you're intoxicated by it. Like it's sort of like you're drunk, but you're not. You're drunk on the creative fluids running through your brain, and it's just taking you. And that's why that's how you see it. The crookedness and the everything else that's there. That's how it comes out through you and your hands and your eyes. But also the part about artwork, it's only in the eyes of the beholder, and you were right. Everyone has a different idea and picks up different things. You can ask, I had a conversation with some other people a couple of weeks ago about an art exhibition, and it was we all had different ideas and opinions on that, and people picked up different things, and that's good because it creates, as you said, a conversation piece where it's continually, it's better than a novel sometimes.
Well, exactly. Oh, yeah. But I can read a novel and you can read a novel, and we can both, you know, have that same discussion as well, you know, and yet it come to So no, I absolutely agree. And people have purchased my work for very odd reasons. Some people have said, "Oh, that colour yellow reminds me when I first met," and so they buy a piece of work based on a colour which was something that happened at a and it takes them somewhere else. Well, that's wonderful. That's good. So every time they look at it, they're reminded of that. And the final thing I just say about, because it is interesting, and just when people have my work on their walls, not always, but usually they say to me, I still look at it every day, or I come in the mornings and I just spend a few seconds looking at it. And someone said to me once, and about 5 years after I bought it, I suddenly realised that the doorway was, you know, and so they're still discovering things. Isn't that fantastic? I mean, I think how great is that? Yeah.
And that's what it's all about.
Absolutely right. Yeah. No, I agree. Okay. Any? Yeah. Sure.
How long have you spent in this painting?
Okay. Well, I mean, firstly, adding up time is always a difficult thing, because I probably thrashed around and painted quite a bit of it in an hour and a half. I got scrapers. I went into it with, you know, gusto or whatever you say, and then I thought, all right, okay, I've got something here now. What do I do? And then I fine tune. Then I pull that out and I bring that back or whatever. So I think in answer to the question, I probably had this on the wall in front of me, and I still worked on it a bit. I changed the moon, very last thing, probably 3 to 4 months. But I wasn't working on it every day, Sometimes every 3 days I'd look at it. Sometimes I say I've got to wait for this to dry, so I'm not going to look at it for 3 or 4 days because I know it'd be dry enough then to flick new marks on or scrape things into. So that's what happens. So, and sometimes working on it, I just work for 5 minutes. I just say, I know what I just need that chord to do, and that's, so it takes me no time to do, but it's a decision. The decision takes a long time. The actual doing of it takes hardly any time at all.
The reason I asked, we've just been in Japan a couple of years ago, and we were walking down this very busy, narrow street full of restaurants and shops and stuff, and there was a guy in his linen suit doing a painting, and I said to Sheila, I said, just go and have a chat to him, you know, and I had a look at the painting. It was absolutely magnificent. It was so detailed. It was like a photograph, right? And I said, do you mind if I ask how long you spent on it? And he said, well, I retired 15 years ago and I've been working on the one painting for 15 years. And he said, if you look up the street, you can see all the shop signs have all changed. And the people are all wearing different clothes.
However, that's amazing, absolutely amazing. But I'll give you the other analogy, which is good for the those creative people might appreciate this one. I think it was Matisse. He's in his 50s, and somebody said, "How can that be any good? It only took you 10 minutes to do. You've just admitted it. You went." We know, and it took you 10 minutes. How can it be any good, and how can it be worth this amount of money? And he said, well, yes, it did take me 10 minutes. However, it really took me 53 years, 4 months, 1 week, 3 days, 2 hours, and 10 minutes to do. And I thought that was a nice statement about, so sometimes things physically take a long time, and sometimes they're a culmination of a lot of experiences, and then you can do it quite fast. Because you obviously learn a few things, as you go along. But, and I thought that was an interesting argument for the people that think that something that happens fast, because I often say to students, all right, well, if you think you can, it's just 3 lines, on a sheet of paper or something. And I say, well, if you can do those 3 lines on a sheet of paper, all well and good, but I bet you can't, because you've got to go all those experiences, all those drawing sessions, all those models, all those bits, and be bloody good too, to finally get to the point where you can go and make it work. Maybe we'll leave it on that point. What do you think? Thank you.